everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are. My name is Gil Ribak. I am an associate professor at the Arizona Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Arizona. This year, I'm wearing another hat. I'm the European Union's Marie Curie Senior Fellow at the Freiburg Institute for Advanced Studies, University of Freiburg, the lovely Schwarzwald area in Germany, in Southwest Germany. Welcome to the Sally and Ralph Duchin Campus Lecture Series, a series that the Duchin family has generously provided both to reach students, faculty, and staff on campus. Usually in pre-COVID times, we used to have that on campus, and also to connect to the wider community. And we're very grateful to the Duchin family for enabling us to offer that. As a reminder, as part of the Shaul and Louis Pozez Memorial Lectureship series on Tuesday next week on December 14th, 7 p.m. Arizona time, the Center for Judaic Studies would host Isabella Tabarovsky for the talk Anti-Zionism is Anti-Semitism, Lessons from the Soviet Jewish Experience. So please be sure to see that event and register for it. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you our speaker tonight, Professor Eric L. Goldstein, who is the Judith London Evans Director of the Tam Institute for Jewish Studies and also Associate Professor of History and Jewish Studies at Emory University. Eric has published many articles about a host of topics, and I can't begin to enumerate them now. He served as the editor of the journal American Jewish History between 2007 and 2012. In 2018, he co-authored with Deborah Weiner the book On Middle Ground, A History of the Jews of Baltimore. In 2006, Eric published the award-winning and highly acclaimed book, The Price of Whiteness, Jews, Race, and American Identity, published by Princeton University Press, which is also the title of his talk this evening. Rather than a formal lecture, Eric and I will discuss the many aspects of this controversial hot-button topic today, and then we will open it up for your questions. I have a request. When you have a question, please put it in the chat. You can use the chat function, and then I can read them after our talk. So let me get the ball rolling and asking Eric, first of all, how did you get to write this book? What are its main points? And what is The Price of Whiteness?
Thank you, Gil. First, I just want to thank you and David Graysboard and everyone at the university for inviting me, and also to thank the Duchins for sponsoring the lecture series. I'm delighted to be with you all tonight. This book was originally my doctoral dissertation at the University of Michigan, and the way that I came to the topic is that when I entered graduate school, there was only a very small cohort of students studying Jewish history. And so for our introductory courses, I was placed in the US history group. And we, like in most programs, we take a course that introduces us to the main literature of our field. And it struck me very quickly that race was, if not one of, really the main theme that went through all of the different books that we were reading. I mean, it really struck me in a way that I hadn't appreciated till then how significant a theme it was in shaping US history. And as someone who was coming to the program interested in the role of Jews in the United States, it really caused me to struggle with the question of, well, where do Jews fit in here? They do not sort of fall under the typical understanding of race or a racial minority, the way that we understand in the US today. And so I really struggled to think about how Jews fit in. And then eventually we came around to a book which was still new at that time, which was a book by David Roediger called The Wages of Whiteness. And it was sort of a pioneering book in the field that's now referred to as Whiteness Studies, which I know you're going to ask me about in a little while. And there were some other books and articles coming out at the time in this vein. And the idea was they looked at different immigrant groups, and most of those early books and articles focused on the Irish in America. And they introduced the idea that immigrants did not think of themselves as white before coming to the US, that it was a category that was that emanated from US history, of course, some other colonial societies as well. But for many European immigrants, they had not typically thought of themselves as white, or that wasn't a relevant category for them until coming to the US. And so there was this stream of books on how the Irish became white. And of course, this was my window into thinking about Jews. If this was an avenue for thinking about the Irish experience in the US, surely there was a similar story about Jews. But I was dissatisfied with a lot of that early literature. Primarily, the idea of the wages of whiteness and of this early literature was that, on the one hand, it did treat race as a social category, as a constructed category, meaning it didn't take it as a natural biological category, but it recognized that it is a cultural category. But still, I felt that they described the process of quote unquote becoming white in a rather, simple way. And also the main thrust was that in becoming American, they also came to think of themselves as white. And what that process entailed was the gaining of certain privilege, that it was a kind of buying in to American racism. And it was a way of the idea of the wages of whiteness is that although poor Irish immigrants were maybe on the same socioeconomic level as poor African Americans in, say, the 1860s, the fact that they could appeal to the idea of whiteness and claim that they were part of the white population gave them a kind of psychological wage, which could make them feel superior to African Americans. Well, there were many things about this narrative that just didn't seem to fit the Jewish case for me. I knew that Jews had a much different relationship with African Americans, not all good, not all positive, but at least more complex than what was being described here. And also I felt that these books didn't really take into account what role Irishness, Irish identity, the immigrant identity played. That my sense was that Jews, as I thought about what it meant for Jews to become part of the white population, I knew this was also part of a larger story of assimilation, of integration, and that Jewish identity, the thinking of oneself as a Jew and what that meant, how they defined it, that must have also played a role in shaping what it meant. I knew it shaped a role in how they came to think of themselves as American. It must also have played a role in how they came to think of themselves as white. And then I hit on the fact that before World War II, Jews very often were referred to by others and referred to themselves as a race. And not always in a negative sense. A lot of this literature had the same thing with the Irish race, and the idea of them becoming white was getting rid of this marginalization of being a different racial group But what I saw is that Jews were often quite attached to the idea of their difference. They used the term race in a very positive sense. So my work took two directions which were somewhat different than the existing literature. I tried to show that this process of engagement with American racial categories was more complicated for Jews. And my feeling is it was more complicated for all immigrant groups than many accounts show. But that becoming white certainly bestowed privileges on them. It was in many ways, they were encouraged to identify that way by the larger society. There certainly were material benefits, status benefits, but it also caused them to feel that they had to give up ways of defining themselves that were very emotionally satisfying, and that they couldn't, in going through that process, they had to give up terms like race to describe themselves, which at the time was the only way of describing a sense of group cohesion, of a feeling of shared ancestry, of community. So there was a certain price to this process as a group, although they certainly benefited as individuals. The expectation that European immigrants would become white, there were strings attached, and there was pressure to gain that acceptance, not to be too different from the mainstream. And so I was sort of complicating this literature on whiteness, but also I felt I was trying to complicate the literature on American Jewish history, because American Jewish history had largely been told as a story of kind of positive adaptation to American culture, that Jews were able to, it was the one country where Jews were able to synthesize their Jewish identity with membership in the larger society. And when viewed through the lens of race, I found that it was a much more traumatic and complicated story. And there were elements of, that works if you think of America only in a purely positive sense. But there were aspects of American identity that Jews were more ambivalent about embracing, and that didn't fit as well with some of their long-held values, their desire to maintain a certain level of distinctiveness. Becoming white entailed thinking, positioning themselves vis-a-vis African Americans in ways that sometimes made Jews uncomfortable because of the connotations of being like people who they associate with their own oppressors in Russia or Germany. So it was a very ambivalent, difficult process. And I tried to point to the fact that the process of becoming American was not just a happy, easy transition and the creation of a great synthesis, but that there were a lot of hard choices, a lot of losses along the way. And it's a very difficult story. And I think we still see that today in Jews' kind of fraught relationship with race and racial categories.
Thank you, Eric. And we'll get back, you will circle back to the question of the present. So if I can ask you kind of bluntly, in what period did Jews become white folks, so to speak?
Right. That's an important question, because, periodization is the most important tool that historians have for understanding the past. But I have resisted the language that a lot of these early studies used about, how the Irish became white, how Jews became white folks, which was the title of an earlier book, because I want to suggest that this isn't just something that happened at a particular time, but that whiteness is a certain category of identity, Jewishness is a certain category of identity, and these different identities have interacted with each other and made their claims on Jews in different ways in different periods, depending on a number of factors. If we really think of identities as something that are cultural constructs and not kind of just innate characteristics, then they're created by historical circumstances. And so the way that Jews related to the category of whiteness and the way that they defined what it meant to be Jewish changed over time. It was different for German Jewish immigrants in the 19th century than it was for Russian Jewish immigrants in the, and then as they became more Americanized, their concerns and changed, and they may have emphasized different aspects. Also, it was different for men than it was different from women. Jews in the North had a different set of concerns than Jews in the South. So, I prefer to think of it as that these categories just continue to interact with each other and make claims on Jews, but not necessarily in a linear fashion. Now, that said, I do want to say that 1945 was a big watershed in American Jewish history. And it's really the period after World War II when Jews really became more fully integrated, socially integrated into the white dominant culture. So, if you had to choose a date, you could say that there was an important shift then, that a lot of the uncertainty about where Jews fit in the American racial system was, resolved. I hate to use the word resolved, but that there was less uncertainty about whether Jews were securely white after 1945. But one needs to look no farther than the recent uptick in anti-Semitism in the United States to see that that wasn't the end of the story. I mean, although today few people would question whether Jews of European descent are considered white or think of themselves as white, and yet, it doesn't necessarily mean this, as I said, doesn't mean the same thing at all times. And now thinking more about Jews, say, vulnerability to anti-Semitism, which was not as prevalent a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades ago. It just shows that these things are always evolving, and that perhaps Jews have a somewhat different relationship to whiteness, even though they're still considered white in the current period than they did even a decade ago.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very interesting point, and I remember when I was reading your book, I was recalling something that the famous American humorist Dorothy Parker, who himself, I believe her dad was Jewish, her mother was not. She is alleged to have said, quote, "The Jews are just like everybody else, only more so," unquote. So do you agree with that? Because I think in your book you showed that the Jewish relationship with race changed over time. It fluctuated. And the Jewish ambivalence about self-definition, the need to be the same, but yet different, continued as a very important thread throughout the 20th century.
Yes, well, I think in some ways that quote by Dorothy Parker is correct in that Jews are different. You know, I hate to make any claims of exceptionalism, but I do think that American Jews have been unusual in that in many ways they have the qualities of an outsider group, but unlike many other minority groups, they have had an really unusual experience of integration and a dramatic rise on the social and economic ladder in the United States. And so they have kind of this dual quality of insiders and outsiders. And I think that means that they are preoccupied more than many other groups in constantly having to think about their identity and think about what their relationship is to the larger society in which they hope to fit. And I think that's kind of the idea of they're like everyone else, only more so in that other people don't have to think about these things. They just do it normally. And Jews who are in this situation of integration and thinking about their position vis-a-vis the larger society, they have to constantly think about it. And so sometimes perhaps they accentuate some of these things, more than people who just take these qualities for granted. But I think that where I would part from that is this is also a kind of marginalization. I mean, in other words, like I said, Jews maybe have a somewhat different experience of being a minority group than some of the classic American minorities, particularly African Americans, other people of color, in that they were able to fit into white society. But as I sort of said at the outset when I was talking about the Irish and so on, this process wasn't just a totally positive process of benefit and gain, but that a group that tries to fit in and then feels all kinds of pressures and limits and expectations placed on them, and is only accepted with under certain terms and conditions, and that they are coerced in some ways, pressured to give up certain aspects of their identity. It's not the classic minority story in the United States, but it is I call it in my work a kind of another kind of otherness. The case of a group that is allowed to fit in, that is given access to the halls of influence and status and privilege, but with certain strings attached. And that's a particular type of minority consciousness and identity that's different than those of many other groups. But so it's a way in which maybe they're not like everybody else. One of the key points of my book is that Jews simply, in many cases, don't fit the categories that American life has laid out for understanding, minorities, insiders, outsiders. They defy categorization. So that's a way in which they're really not like everyone else, only more so.
And therefore, this intercategory of race, ethnicity, religion, where they're kind of spread out on all categories or any kind of mixture of those categories. And I think you already referred to that, but my next question is that in your book, you mentioned whiteness studies. You already touched upon that. What are exactly whiteness studies? And again, beyond what you already described, do Jews fit, if at all, into that paradigm? And how are those perspectives, and this is kind of, again, the controversial thing, how are those perspectives true, if at all, to critical race theory?
Right. So Whiteness Studies was, as far as I was concerned, when I was reading this literature and thinking about writing about this topic, I never experienced being part of a school of thought or I think that we have the tendency to look at certain bodies of scholarship and name them and think of them as a more coherent set of ideas than they really are. And so I never considered, in conversation, I may say, I read books in Whiteness Studies, or I may in some way be part of that field. But, I think there are many different approaches. I mean, I could name 6 books about, there are books about different immigrant groups, the Irish, Jews, Arab Americans, Italians. Each of them have a totally different argument and idea about how this process of interacting with whiteness or coming to take on a white identity has worked. So I think it's hard to call it some kind of a unified school of thought. And I think that sometimes happens when critics or people who are uncomfortable with some of the ideas want to oppose a certain way of thinking. And so they draw a circle around it and they label it as a sort of school of thought so that it's easy, it sort of becomes a straw man. I think that's true of critical race theory too. I mean, I could say that I'm part of some kind of extended group of scholars in something called Whiteness Study, but I never experienced, even in my teaching, I never read the literature of critical race. I mean, critical race theory, as I understand it, is a body of theoretical literature that has pertained in certain fields, but it by no means is something that informs all scholars who work on issues of race or identity. I think it's the same case where it's a sort of very particular set of writings and ideas that has been kind of latched onto as a way of, opposing any kind of critical thinking about the idea of race. And that's not really what it is. It certainly has not been those particular ideas have not been a significant factor in my work, nor do I know any scholars in Jewish studies who have used those ideas.
Okay, thank you. And because we already started talking about the present and present times, and I think I sent you a quote, a recent article of the psychologist Pamela Pereski, and she wrote something very interesting. I'm just going to quote, it's a very recent article, a year or 2 years ago. And she wrote, quote, "At a time when the moral imperative is to be less white," and be less white is in quotes, inside the quotes, "there is no identity more pernicious than that of once a powerless minority group that, rather than joining the struggle to dismantle whiteness, opted into it," unquote. Do you agree with that? Do you think this is the case today?
Right. Well, I mean, I assume you want me to respond in terms of the Jewish experience, although the quote doesn't particularly name Jews. But, well, one thing I'll say is that in my work, one of the things going into this topic, a lot of the literature on Jews and race in the US was about what some scholars have called Black-Jewish relations. And there was a kind of current in that work that assumed that most relationships between African Americans and Jews were positive, that Jews had been advocates of the civil rights movement and so on, and that there was an alliance between African Americans and Jews. And I was writing more of a social history of average Jews, and one of the big takeaways is that is was much more complicated than that. And what I like to say is that what I discovered is that there really was no one predictable stance that Jews took toward African Americans and issues of things like racial segregation. But it all just depended on which Jews, when you were talking about, what the circumstances were. To the extent that Jews were outsiders who were trying to become insiders, what I found is that could have opposite consequences in different situations. In one situation, an outsider wants to become an insider, so they do whatever they can to identify with the larger society and its values. And so there were cases, say in the early 20th century where there were Jewish immigrants or, who were in that position, feeling very threatened, feeling very marginalized, wanting to show that they belonged in American culture, who might have made some aggressive assertions of racism or been very concerned with, say, living in the right neighborhood, not too close to African Americans, or, particularly in the South, for example, scrupulously following the racial etiquette of the region to show that they were a proper member of the larger society. But in another set of circumstances, say where Jews were not particularly worried about their level of acceptance, or even in a later period of American Jewish history where Jews were perhaps even worried about their group becoming too assimilated, there might be a great appeal in identifying with a minority group like African Americans. And so, and in that context, the similarities between Black and Jewish history could be highlighted. And it made more sense to highlight the similarities. For a Julius Rosenwald, the head of the Sears Corporation, Jewish philanthropist in the early 20th century, he's an example of someone who had sort of made it in American society. He didn't have to worry too much about being accepted. He was, one of the wealthiest individuals in Chicago. And so it makes sense to me that he was not too worried about showing how white he was, that he could see the parallels between the Black and Jewish experiences, and he devoted a lot of his fortune to helping African Americans. But then there were poor immigrants in the same period who took quite a different stance. All of this is to say that, I think that being a group that was once, as this quote says, once a powerless minority group, that can function in different ways. And you can see that today among different minority groups. Not just because one belongs to a minority group doesn't necessarily mean they're naturally sympathetic with the plight of other minority groups, especially if they're in a somewhat different position in society. The other thing I think is that it's somewhat unfair to set a higher bar for Jews, for example, than for other white members of the dominant society. And this is one thing that I regret, because the whole field of literature that my book is a part of, a lot of whiteness studies has focused on the experience of immigrant groups. And I think there's a negative tendency to then think of immigrants as the ones who are sort of responsible for all the bad, things about white privilege and racial hierarchy. The real story, if you read my book, is that Jews were responding. They weren't always in a powerful position, and they were responding to the powers that be, the dominant white, native-born Protestant middle-class leaders of society. They were, in many ways, they had more of an interest in Jews becoming white than Jews did themselves. And they set the terms of Jewish integration into the United States. They're the ones who exacted the price, right, that we're talking about. And I think not enough of the literature focuses on those people, on the members of the dominant society who were, much more powerfully responsible for setting the terms of racism in the United States. So I wish in some ways, I think there's a danger for groups like Jews becoming emblems of whiteness and white privilege and so on, because they're also an easily identifiable group. It's hard to kind of focus on a large group that it's hard to kind of draw a circle around and identify. So I think there's a way in which sometimes some of these groups who have become seen as white, they can sort of take the blame for what was really much more dictated by the larger native-born society. Let me also, I just want to bring it up to the present, because I know people will be interested in understanding what this has to do with the present. I think while it's, unfair to kind of put more onus on Jews and other, say European minority groups that went through this process of acculturation, I do think Jews are they're very well positioned today to play a very important and active role in the movement to dismantle white racism and the structures of white privilege. Because on the one hand, they now are part of the dominant society and they play very important roles in key institutions in American society because of that integration into white society. And yet at the same time, many Jews of European descent still maintain a kind of minority consciousness. And so they can both understand and be sensitive to problems of racism, and yet they're also well positioned to make a difference in the key institutions of influence. So I think in that sense, there's a real opportunity for Jews to make a difference in this. And I think sometimes Jews feel like what is their place in all of this? But I think they actually have a very important role to play. The other thing is, a friend of mine and colleague, Eric Ward, who's the executive director of the Western States Center, he wrote an influential article a couple of years ago after Charlottesville called "Skin in the Game." And you can find it online if you Google it. It's about how anti-Semitism is a thread of white nationalism. And his argument is that Jews in the United States have a real stake in fighting white nationalism, white racism, not just for the obvious reasons that we all should be concerned with these things, but as Jews, that anti-Semitism is actually a key component of white nationalism. He describes that white racists in the U.S. Faced a problem because in the wake of the civil rights movement and the great progress African Americans made in attaining greater rights in the U.S. and the fact that we've had an African American president, and that it sort of upends the narrative of white supremacists, right? That they say African Americans are inferior, and yet how do you explain all the events and achievements and the importance that so many people of color play in American society? So he says that anti-Semitism comes in and plays a role in explaining that in their ideology, that they blame Jews for being the kind of force behind, that has aided racial minorities, and that if not for the assistance of Jews who are not, loyal to white supremacy, these people of color would not have attained, the status and influence that they have in American society. So anti-Semitism becomes a kind of explanatory logic for explaining what they can't explain about, and you saw that also in the Pittsburgh massacre, the Tree of Life Synagogue, where the gunmen blamed Jews for aiding Latino immigrants coming across the southern border. So again, these things are all connected. So he says that Jews have, a stake, he calls it skin in the game, in fighting white nationalism because it's also fighting anti-Semitism. I add to that, if you understand my book, I'm saying that the importance of whiteness as a category, that the dominant culture was a white culture, and that you had to follow these codes and to fit in, Jews had to give up certain aspects of their difference to be accepted as white. And they couldn't define themselves in certain ways. They couldn't be too different from mainstream society. So my idea is that as long as whiteness remains a dominant category in the United States, Jews will never sort of escape the pressures of assimilation, of the pressures of conformity, and that only in a society in which racial hierarchy is no longer a major factor can all groups, including Jews, be truly free to express their cultural distinctiveness. So I think that Jews have skin in the game, not only because of the reason, to fight anti-Semitism, which is part of white nationalism, but also to really, help build a society in which Jewishness is a valid identity, and Jewish difference can be expressed, and Jews don't have to constantly, Jews of European background don't, they can sort of be freed from this pressure to conform to the expectations of white society.
And that's even without going into the very, another minefield, which is Jews of color, one of the growing, groups among, it's not only the Ashkenormative ones, but also groups of brown or black Jews.
Yes, and I want to say that's why I'm careful. Sometimes people ask me, well, you're just talking about European Jews. So I'm careful to say Jews of European descent. And I think it's legitimate for me to have focused on that group because, from a historical standpoint, that was the vast majority of Jews in the US. And I think that it's necessary to focus on the way in which they were integrated into white America and the claims it made on them and the extent to which they, embraced a lot of the key ideas of codes of white society. So I don't want to, yes, I understand that Jews as a group truthfully have always been racially diverse, although not in as great numbers as today. But I think it's important to tell that story. But I do think that the fact that we have an ever-growing population of Jews of color in the United States, and the Jews of color are playing a much more visible and active role in the Jewish community and the leadership of the Jewish community, is a key aspect of the possibility that I was mentioning of perhaps disentangling Jewishness and whiteness. Because, one of the things that white privilege does is it makes whiteness a kind of an identity that's taken for granted, that's not marked and visible. I think that the fact that the Jewish community is becoming more racially diverse, I think will cause people to consider, think about the relationship of Jewishness and whiteness. And I think that it will make it harder to just equate, just to assume that all Jews are white. And so I think this, as this continues, I think that Jews of color can be an important factor in helping the Jewish community disentangle what it means to be Jewish from being white.
Yeah, thank you. So I think now we'll move to, there are already a few questions here from the audience. Thank you, Eric, for a very interesting presentation. There is a question, a two-part question here. Did the Jews who worked in the civil rights movement of the 1950s, 1960s, think of themselves as white or as Jewish? That is to say, when Rabbi Heschel marched with Martin Luther King Jr., was he doing so as a white or as a Jewish guy?
Right, good question. I think it depends on who you're talking about. Many of, for example, if you think about freedom riders, right? Mostly young people who went down to places like Mississippi in the early 60s to do things like register people to vote or to stage sit-ins in lunchrooms. There were a high proportion of young Jews who joined those efforts. And I think many of them were thinking of themselves as a kind of a part of a universal, in other words, they were thinking of themselves in kind of universal terms. They were thinking that they were moving beyond particular racial and ethnic identities. And for example, Mickey Schwerner, who was, one of the three young men killed in Mississippi by the Ku Klux Klan, his widow, Rita Schwerner, was interviewed and she was specifically asked about his Jewish identity. And she was very clear in saying that he wasn't thinking about it in that way. He was thinking about it in terms of, we need to leave all of these particular identities behind and just be a unified society. That said, I don't think from a historian's perspective that means that his Jewish background had nothing to do with why he was there. In other words, there's a reason why there was disproportionate Jewish participation. So the way one thinks of themselves is not necessarily the same as the historical explanation for why they were there. So I think certainly the Jewish background of many of those people, the fact that their families were in the throes of a process of integration. They were perhaps more sensitive to these issues of equality, of inclusion. They were positioned by their family's history and their family's cultural sensitivities, but ideologically, many of them did not necessarily, lead with their Jewish identity. But, then there were also rabbis who were active in the civil rights movement. As I mentioned, not all Jews were civil rights activists. Believe me, there were many who weren't. I tried to think about the particular categories of people who were, and for example, rabbis are a group that has always been disproportionately involved in civil rights activity, even in the early 20th century, partly because rabbis are in a different category. They didn't rely on the larger community for their employment, not like a merchant who had to worry about what his customers would think. And also rabbis as clergy, I think, were expected to take somewhat morally forward positions. So you see a lot of rabbis active in the civil rights movement. So, they certainly thought of themselves as Jews and thought of what they were doing as having to do with their Jewishness. But I still think they undoubtedly also thought of themselves as white. I mean, I think it would have, for most Jews in the 50s and 60s, it probably would have been very unusual, if not impossible, for them not to think of themselves as white. There were just a couple of random individuals who we can point to who took a somewhat different path, like if you've read James Waters', I think that's his name, book about The Color of Water, where he talks about his mother was Jewish and his father was African American. Walker, right.
Yeah. McBride.
Oh, McBride. You're right.
Yes.
Right. I'm sorry. I apologize.
Yeah.
It's The Color of Water. That's the title of the book. But I mean, that's an example of a Jewish woman who kind of assimilated into an African American community instead of assimilating into a white community. And there, are a couple other stories like Mez Mezzaro, the jazz musician. Yeah. I mean, similar kind of, but those were really the exceptions to the rule. And I think that it was very hard to think of oneself as Jewish outside of, of whiteness.
Yeah. There's another question here, and because you mentioned about live and mixing, there's another question. You mentioned 1945 as a watershed moment in American Jewish history. Do you see this as a result of the mixing of Jews with others, including other white ethnics, in their wartime experience? And do you see the experience of the Jewish baby boomers mixing in college in the 1960s and 1970s as significant?
Yes. The key thing that happened after 1955 was social integration. In the period between the wars, Jews, and I don't want to make a generalization about all Jews because there were different Jewish, segments of the community, but by and large, the great majority of the Jewish population in the interwar period were the sort of second generation Jews whose parents had come as East European immigrants. And they mostly lived in large urban centers, and they had not achieved full social integration. They were acculturated. When I teach American Jewish history, I tell my students, I hammer into their heads, this is a period of acculturation without integration, meaning that they were fully American culturally, but they often still lived in Jewish neighborhoods. There were restrictions in certain professions. There were restrictions in higher education. There were, as I said, neighborhoods where they couldn't live. They mostly married within their own community. So socially, they were still very segregated from other, white non-Jews. And that really begins to break down as a result of World War II and after World War II. You see Jews starting to move to neighborhoods where they live among other white Americans, some of whom were also children of other immigrant groups, but not exclusively. You see Jews entering higher education and the professions in much larger numbers. You see them breaking all sorts of barriers. Anti-Semitism declined precipitously. So there's just a process of social integration where Jews are entering many of the key institutions of American life, of white America, and also probably more successfully than a lot of other European ethnic groups. So, and then this was a process that happened over the course of the 20th century. It didn't all happen at once. But my sense is by 1965, there was a kind of swinging of the pendulum. And finally, you had now another generation who was born into an integrated setting, and they were perhaps somewhat less concerned about fitting in and showing that they were part of the larger society. So this is the generation of many Jews who joined the civil rights movement, who felt more at home expressing their Jewish distinctiveness. So anyway, yes, certainly the integration of Jews in that period facilitated them coming to be seen as white. It can't be understated the fact that the US was fighting the Nazis in World War II. There was a sort of government interest in embracing what some historians have called inclusive nationalism. So FDR, for example, during his administration, they really wanted to counterpose the US to Nazi Germany. So there were actually propaganda campaigns around themes of Americans all, showing all people of different ethnic groups, all Americans, fighting kind of what they called racial hatreds between different ethnic groups. So there was also a kind of government interest toward bringing those children of immigrants into the mainstream of society, first for the war effort, also, frankly, for the success of the Democratic Party. This is the period when Jews are brought into the Democratic coalition in large numbers. So there were all sorts of reasons in that period that facilitated Jewish integration into white America.
The Cold War, some historians also mentioned the Cold War as something which integrate white ethnics, Catholics and Jews. And then, of course, you have the Judeo-Christian legacy and the triple melting pot, the Will Herberg ideas. Yes. And all that.
One thing I just would add is that although this was a period of great advancement of integration for Jews, you see the trade-offs. This was also the period in which Jewish ethnicity, the term race virtually disappears in this period. And even attempts to express to use other terms to describe Jewish difference, ethnicity, they don't really succeed in the same way. And Jews are really pushed to define themselves mainly as a religious denomination. I don't think they really thought of themselves purely in that way, but their kind of sense of themselves as an ethnic community, a cultural community, a social community. In some ways, they had to be very guarded with that. It kind of went underground. And to the public, they spoke about the Judeo-Christian tradition and they built synagogues on the suburban frontier. But, so there was a kind of way in which to the public, they defined themselves as a religious group. But in those synagogues, they were still having, social gatherings, and they were thinking of themselves as in much more expansive terms. So it shows some of the cost, that yes, this was a great period of strides for the community in terms of integration, but there was a lot of pressure during that period, certainly with the Cold War and the Red Scare and McCarthyism. They were also very afraid of not perfectly seizing all these opportunities that were offered to them, and that they finally, they did to a great extent feel the pressure to attenuate expressions of difference. And I think that led up after 1965 because it became more acceptable in US society.
Thank you. There's a question here: how is the issue of whiteness and assimilation looked at within the Orthodox or the more religious Jewish world that is less secular? Is that an issue? Is that still an issue in that world?
Right. Well, I want to say something historically and today. I think historically, Orthodox Jews were less involved in thinking about these categories. That to some extent, thinking about whiteness, defining oneself in relationship to whiteness was it was a byproduct of the process of acculturation and integration. And to the extent that Orthodox Jews were less acculturated and historically and less, integrated socially into the larger society, they continued to live in a world that was a largely Jewish world. And so these ideas may have existed on the margins of their consciousness, but their everyday life, they were thinking of themselves as Jewish, and they weren't so much thinking of themselves in relationship to African Americans or other whites. So you almost see you see mostly Reform rabbis who are kind of thinking about civil rights or puzzling over the question of, are Jews a race? Are they a religion? Conservative, first of all, the conservative movement didn't kind of fully emerge until, the first few decades of the 20th century. But sort of the more traditional someone was, probably the less they thought about these issues, because it was, like I say, a byproduct of acculturation. Today, I think it's almost impossible for any Jewish person of European background in the US to not engage with the categories of whiteness. And also, many Orthodox Jews today live in urban centers where they regularly interact with African Americans and other people of color. And also, I think that even, for example, Hasidic Jews, Orthodox Jews who live in those settings, they do benefit in ways that our society affords privilege to whites in certain contexts, in government context and policing. But I think they still have, because of the fact that they're still kind of socially segregated from, they're not very well integrated into the larger white population. They do still can kind of bracket those issues and feel like they are not, it's someone else's issue. It's so, I think there are ways in which that has been the source of some conflict between the Orthodox community and the African American community, like the Crown Heights riots, because I think that African Americans see them as privileged whites, but that isn't their understanding of themselves. They see themselves as a minority group that is apart from the larger society. And so it's like two communities looking at each other and not seeing the same thing. So I think it creates certain tensions and difficulties.
So because you, by the way, mentioned the tensions and the difficulties, there is a question here. What about the African-American backlash against Jews? Was it a form of anti-colonialism? Is it now as virulent as it once was?
I'm not exactly sure what the question's referring to, but
maybe from the 60s onward, people talked about Black anti-Semitism as
yes. Well, I think this is how people talk about the end of a kind of historic alliance between Blacks and Jews. I think to some extent that's a problematic formulation, because I'm not sure that the idea of an alliance, historical alliance, was really accurate to begin with. But I do think that there is some tension created between African Americans and Jews in the United States, especially since the mid 60s, around this kind of, seeing I think each group tends to see the world through their own historical experience. And for some reason, we expect those experiences to be the same because we think like, this is what it means to be a minority. And they're not the same. And Jews had a sort of, somewhat successful story of integration and rise on the economic ladder. And I think they tend to see the possibility of America in a different way. They didn't experience America in the same way. And I think that, and also I think as Jews became more and more integrated, because they do have a kind of, it's almost part of Jewish identity to think of oneself as an outsider. I think that became even more and more prevalent. It's sort of ironic, the more Jews integrated, the more they wanted to compare themselves to African Americans, the more they wanted to talk about a historical alliance, because in some ways I think it was a way of mitigating the trauma, the costs of integration and assimilation. It was a way in which they kept thinking of themselves as a minority group, but really their historical experience was getting more and more distant from that of a typical minority group. So I think, there's a lot of tension because many American Jews very much are invested. They want to be considered a minority group. They want to have their identity in some ways validated by being included in, the rainbow of multiculturalism and so on. And I think there's sometimes a backlash from African Americans who feel that this is perhaps a way of deflecting some of the responsibility for being part of white society and for enjoying the benefits of being a part of white society. So I think it's a reflection of the fact that each group sees the United States and American society through the lens of their own experience, and perhaps they need to think more about what perhaps they look like in somebody else's eyes, or not that everyone doesn't experience the world through the same lens.
So I think we have time for one more question, and it's from a former student of mine, Paul. And he said, how incredibly complicated this topic. Now I'm even less sure whether for Jews being included as whites has overall been a blessing or a curse, considering the balance of cost versus benefit. And maybe we can end with this question, because it's really, you complicated things for us, intellectuals who make life much more, complicated than simplified things. Was it more of a blessing or more of a curse? Because I can think one answer until the 1960s, and maybe from the 70s onward, maybe a different kind of concerns and answers.
Right. I mean, I think it's an impossible question to ask, because I just think it shows, like I said, that when you view Jewish history through the lens of race, it's not really a happy story. It's not a story of synthesis and of being able to be both Jewish and American. It's a story of tensions and feeling pulled between contrary tendencies and impulses. And it's a story of loss and of wanting one thing but not wanting to give up something. It's all of these things which show that it was a much more difficult story. I mean, yes, certainly in a material way, in terms of status and inclusion, Jews benefited in terms of having the protection of legal rights that were often limited to whites. They benefited. And I think, while it was happening, they weren't so as conscious as we are today of, today we look back and we see that a lot of how American society was structured by assumptions about white supremacy and so on. So, I think it's hard to it certainly was viewed differently 50 years ago than it is today. But I think today, looking back, we see it in a much different light than when it was happening. I mean, I think, all that said, I think it's, I don't think Jewish success and Jewish, prosperity and in the United States is only the result of the structures of white racism. I mean, Jewish immigrants certainly, it doesn't mean they didn't work hard and that they didn't, strive for, and that, they didn't do all the things that they should have done. It's just a complicated story. And I think we have to just be open to understanding it in all of its complexity, and not, telling morality tales, and also not flattening it out into just a simple success story either. That it had its good parts, it had its bad parts. And I think that we can learn a lot from this history, and that we can, like I said, the Jews in the United States, I think that in a way, this history positions them in a very, unusual way to play a really significant role in helping to solve some of the most significant problems in American society today. So I think while being in this weird position of part insider, part outsider, hard to categorize, it certainly had its trials and tribulations. But I think we're in a moment where perhaps American Jews can seize that unique position to make an unusual difference in American society.
Thank you so much. I think this is the hour. Thank you, Professor Goldstein. Thank you, Eric, for showing us how complicated this very intricate topic is. Thank you so much for your questions and your comments. I apologize that I could not reach all of you because there was a list here, and I tried to select those that came first or that seem more pertinent. Please don't forget to log on to our next event next Tuesday. Thank you, Eric, again, and I hope all of you have a wonderful evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.